Hi guys, this is Thursday's lecture over chapter 13 on personality. I don't really have a lot of housekeeping to tell you about today other than just to remind you to get your research participation / alternative assignments done by the 30th. But other than that, I don't have much else to say, so let's get rolling. So today we're talking about personality and a couple of the perspectives and theories on personality and kind of how it develops and how stable it is over time and what causes us to be kind of the way we are. So today we'll talk about the classical perspectives and the humanistic theories, and then next time we'll get into the contemporary perspectives. So first off, basic definition, what is personality? Our definition of personality is an individual's characteristic patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting. So this is our enduring patterns of behavior, which means that it doesn't really change. It's pretty constant. It might fluctuate based on circumstance, sure, but it still stays pretty consistent within its spectrum. So like cheerfulness, for example, is one personality trait. A cheerful person, oh, this is a highlighter. A cheerful person probably has a range of cheerfulness, depending on the circumstance. Obviously, at a funeral, they're going to be less cheerful, and then at a more cheerful. But they still kind of fall within their range of cheerfulness. Whereas another person whose range of cheerfulness might be a little bit lower down here, uh, they might range in the same way, a little bit lower at funerals and higher at graduations, but their highest cheerfulness still isn't as cheerful as someone else's low cheerfulness. So our pattern is pretty enduring, but it does fluctuate on circumstance. But nonetheless, a cheerful person is still cheerful at all times, more so than a not cheerful person. When we're going through our perspectives, the first perspective that we'll talk about is the classical perspective. So this was kind of the first thoughts on what personality might be. This is Freud's theory, commonly known as the psychodynamic theory. And I've mentioned it a couple times before. We'll get into it a little bit more today. And then today we'll also talk about the humanistic theories. So the humanistic theories kind of focus on our inner capacities for growth and self-fulfillment. So it's thinking a lot more positively about humanity. We've talked about these ones too in the past, so these might sound a little bit familiar as well, hopefully. So hopefully that rings a bell when we talk about them today, and then next time we'll talk about the contemporary perspective. So these are today's theories, what we think about it now, and they focus on the basic dimensions of personality, kind of the biological roots of those dimensions, and how our personality interacts with biology. And then we'll talk about a couple specific ones, so the trait theories and social cognitive theories next time. So let's get started on the classical perspectives. Like I said, the first ones that we ever, first people to ever really start thinking about personality and psychology as a whole. And so what the psychodynamic theorists thought was that our behavior was caused by this interaction between our conscious and our unconscious mind. So what they thought was that what was happening internally, outside of our conscious awareness, was playing a big role on our conscious thoughts and behaviors. So what we weren't aware of, what was unconscious, was actually what was really driving the bus, what was really driving our behavior. And the biggest psychodynamic theory was probably Freud's psychoanalytic theory. And his theory had a big emphasis on childhood sexuality and unconscious motivations. Yes, I did say childhood sexuality. That is correct. That is what I said. So like from birth and on, he said that sex and our sexual motivations is what's really driving our personality. We'll talk about some criticisms of that later. And he said that kind of the main goal of therapy and getting better was all about discovering our unconscious. So bring those unconscious thoughts to our conscious awareness. And to do that, he liked to use this technique called free association. And free association is a way of exploring the unconscious by allowing clients to just sit and talk and say whatever they wanted, no matter how trivial or embarrassing it might be. Just talk and say whatever they please, because he thought that nothing was accidental of what they said, that any slip of the tongue might give insight to the unconscious, saying a word wrong, doing something like that. Just letting people speak will bring to light some of those unconscious motivations. So what did he think our personality kind of was, and what was it made of? Well, he said that our personality has this structure of interacting systems, and that it's made of 3 parts: the id, ego, and the superego. So the first one that we have, the one that we're kind of born with, is the id. And the id just wants to satisfy our basic drives any way that it can. So it's very impulsive. It operates on the pleasure principle, so it just wants immediate gratification all the time. So he said that this is, really the main factor, the main system that children have, right? So like small kids just yanking toys from other people's hands, screaming when they don't get what they want. That's their id, trying to just get immediate gratification any way that it can without considering, repercussions or anything like that. He said that whenever we get a little bit older, we start to really develop our ego. And he said that our ego was this executive part of our personality that kind of operates under a reality principle. So it uses logic to kind of figure out the best, most realistic way to get that gratification, to get things that we want in ways that won't hurt us so bad in the long run. So as kids get older, they learn to ask nicely for toys instead of just yanking them out of people's hands. They learn that they have to finish their homework before that they can play their games so that they won't be interrupted later on. So using that reality principle, figuring out what they need to do to get what they want without getting in trouble or getting those same consequences that they might get if the ego was, or I'm sorry, the id was the only one driving the bus. And then later on, into like young adulthood, he said that our superego starts to develop and become stronger. And our superego is our moral compass. It's our conscious. So, what is the ideal thing to do? What's the right thing to do? This is where our values come into play. What society says is the right thing to do comes into play. So our superego is constantly striving to be perfect and to live up to standards, and it feels really guilty whenever it doesn't reach that. So our superego tells us to tell the truth in all circumstances, to always be on time, to live up to those values and expectations that society has for us. So if we have a really strong superego, then we're very virtuous, right? We have a strong moral compass. We do things right all the time, and we feel very guilt-ridden when we don't. And if we have a weak superego, then we're pretty self-indulgent. We kind of do what we want, and we're pretty remorseless about that fact. So he said that everybody's got these 3 parts, and kind of that dynamic between them all, fighting each other, fighting the wants and needs that they all want, is what drives our personality, really creates who we are. So, like I said earlier, Freud's theory really emphasized our sexual stages. He said that our sexual drives and motivations is what is a big part of what's driving our bus. So he said that we pass through these stages in this order, and each stage presents kind of its own challenge for us to overcome. And he said that as we're passing through these stages, if we kind of have unresolved conflict in any of them, then we might get fixated on kind of the pleasure-seeking energies at that stage, all the way up into adulthood. So if you look at these stages, there's the oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. So just one that I wanted to point out was this anal stage. So if you've ever heard the term anal retentive, this is where that term comes from. So this time in our life from 18 to 36 months is when we're potty training and we're trying to control our own life. And Freud would say that a person who is, constantly anal about something, constantly anal retentive about something, very controlling, Freud would say that it's because that person had a conflict during that stage and became fixated on that stage, and it never really got resolved. And then it followed them, that anal retentiveness followed them into adulthood. So that's where the term being anal comes from, if you were wondering. So, Freud said that there's always kind of conflict between our id and our superego, the one that always wants instant gratification and the one that's trying to be a rule follower. And that conflict causes anxiety for us. So to deal with that anxiety, Freud says that we use defense mechanisms. So our definition of defense mechanisms is the ego's protective methods of reducing anxiety by unconsciously distorting reality. So you guys have probably heard of some of these defense mechanisms before, and Freud would say that these are some of the things that we do to kind of relieve anxiety that we have between the conflict between our id and our superego. So for example, regression is retreating back to an earlier psychosexual stage. So a little boy sucking on his thumb, kind of going back to that oral stage whenever he's feeling anxious, to relieve that anxiety, going back to an earlier psychosexual stage. Reaction formation is switching unacceptable impulses into their opposite. So to repress our angry feelings, a person might be overly happy or overly friendly, right? It's possible that you've done this before. You're feeling really upset, so you put on just a big smile, even though you don't mean it. This is like a very, very jealous person saying, yeah, go ahead, I don't care at all. Great, do it, go out, that sounds awesome. Doing the opposite of what their impulses want. Feeling very jealous, but telling them to do things that wouldn't lead them to think you're jealous. Projection is another one, disguising your own impulses by attributing them to other people. So this example is the thief always thinks everyone else is a thief. Always being suspicious that other people are doing things that you are doing. So like someone who is cheating might be suspicious of their partner cheating. Having that, projecting that impulse onto other people. Rationalization, offering self-justifying explanations in place of the real reasons for why we might do things or why other people might do things. So if you are an alcoholic, you might just say that you're drinking with your friends just to be sociable. Another example would be staying in a bad relationship by rationalizing your partner's behaviors and making excuses for them. Rationalization. Displacement is shifting impulses towards someone or something that is less threatening than the actual object of those impulses. So if you're had a bad day at work and you got really mad at your boss, and then you come home and you kick your dog, or you yell at your mom, or you yell at your girlfriend, yell at your boyfriend, that's displacement. You are displacing that angry impulse and putting it onto someone who is less threatening, because you can't scream at your boss, but you can scream at your dog with less consequences. So taking your anger out on the wrong source. The last defense mechanism is denial, so refusing to believe the reality. So a partner denying the evidence of someone's affair, not believing someone when they tell you horrible news, like a death in the family, something like that, which I'm sure you've all heard of before. Denial. But I do want to tell you guys, what modern theorists think about Freud's theory. This theory, for some reason, if you get a small lecture on psychology in another class, almost always they're going to talk about Freud and his personality structure with the id, ego, and superego. And then that's it. That's your summary of what psychology is. And that's not all that psychology is. That's not even the way that modern theorists think anymore. But for some reason, that's what always comes up because it's the first thing that we ever thought. Today, people have big problems with some of the parts of his theories. They have big problems with his complete emphasis on the unconscious mind because, Freud said that our unconscious is where we deal with all of our problems, and it's not. We do still deal with a lot of problems in our conscious ways. We do deal with them consciously with, effective coping skills. So it's not all just happening on an unconscious level. Another big problem is obviously his emphasis on sex and aggression. A lot of modern theorists don't think that we're just always running around looking for sex and aggression. They do know that we have other driving things that we want in life, like companionship and relationship. So Freud's emphasis on sex was just unfounded and out of his own cocaine-filled mind. Something else to note is just that his theory was bad. It's not supported by any evidence, so it's all kind of hypothetical, just kind of what he thought. You can't even really test it. And a theory that can't be tested is essentially useless. It's great for him, it's great for Freud because he can't be proven wrong, but he also can't be proven right. It's also not very useful because it just kind of explains behavior after the fact and doesn't really give you tools to do anything about it. So like saying, you are feeling this way because of something that happened in your past, the way that your mother treated you or the way that your father treated you as a child. Great, that tells me why I'm acting this way, but it doesn't give me anything that I need to change my behavior to make me feel better. Explaining where a behavior comes from isn't all that it takes. You do need skills to move forward from that. Also, Freud was kind of a known hypocrite because he thought, like I said, he thought everything happens for a reason. Everything is symbolic. Everything that you say and do can uncover some of your unconscious motivations. It's like the way you hold a remote can say something about your unconscious motivations. The way that a tie, points downwards to the area that a tie points down, he said had a symbolic meaning for our unconscious thoughts and motivations. So one day, as the story goes, a student asked him about his cigar because Freud always was known for smoking a cigar. And so they asked him, what the cigar meant, and Freud is known for saying, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. So if you hear this phrase, it means that there's no meaning behind whatever it is you're looking too far into. But Freud says to do that. Freud says to look too far into things. So it's interesting that he would have that to say whenever referring to his own behaviors. So something to consider. Freud, loved to look too far into everybody else's behavior, but wasn't interested in anybody doing that to his behavior. So I think it questions the validity of his theory a little bit. So Freud's theory sucks. That's the thing to remember. However, we'll talk a little bit about some of the ways of assessing personality with the psychodynamic theory. He used two what we call projective tests. So projective tests, when you take a projective test, the goal is for the test taker to project their unconscious conflicts onto ambiguous stimuli. So they have no real meaning, but we want people to project their thoughts and their unconscious onto that ambiguous stimuli. So he used two of them, we have two of them, the thematic apperception test, or the TAT, and then Rorschach ink blots. So these pictures are part of the thematic apperception test. And what a test giver will do is they'll show them the card, and then they'll ask them to tell a story about them from start to finish. What happened before this picture, what's happening in this picture, and then what happens after this picture. And just have them tell the story. Now, for example, if we look at this picture on the bottom left, people can see and tell different stories about it, right? So one person can see this and say that this is a drunken husband who came home in the middle of the night, and this woman is upset about that. And another person could look at this and say, this woman just cheated on her husband, and now she's feeling guilty, and she's about to leave to go home to her husband. These two different stories that someone could tell tells us a lot about them and their unconscious thoughts, what's going on in their lives right now and what's important to them, and probably brings up a lot of those unconscious motivations and feelings. Another one is the Rorschach ink blot test. So this is a series of cards that we show with ink blots. Some are in black and white and some of them are in color. And they're literally just drops of ink with the paper folded in half. So they're not designed to have any, pre-prepared meanings or anything at all. They're supposed to be ambiguous. And so different people see different things. So if one person sees two people fighting and the other person sees two people dancing, then that can tell us something about those people and their unconscious thoughts and motivations. However, these projective tests are really hard to score and really hard to interpret objectively and reliably. People come up with kind of different results if you have different interpreters. So they're really not super common practice anymore and are usually kind of lumped into that, psychodynamic Freud stuff. Yeah, so just to summarize, what we think about the unconscious now is a little bit different than what Freud thought about the unconscious. So Freud thought that, it was made of the id-ego and superego, and that the conflict between those what was really driving our bus, and a lot was happening in the unconscious. Today, our definition of unconscious is just information that occurs without our awareness. And we think that a lot less is happening in the unconscious and a lot more is happening on a conscious level for us. Also, his defense mechanisms, there's really not a lot of evidence of them, especially not evidence that they're being driven by this conflict between our id and our superego. If anything, they're just there to kind of preserve our self-esteem. But we do have some evidence of reaction formation and projection. And projection, really, we have evidence of this because of this false consensus effect. So we do tend to overestimate the extent to which other people share our beliefs and behaviors. So that's why if we're cheating on a spouse, then we might be suspicious that they're cheating as well, because we overestimate the extent that other people share our same behaviors. So that's kind of where our projection typically comes from. Okay, so that's Freud. That's the psychodynamic theory of personality. So we're done talking about Freud. Freud sucks. I'm tired of talking about Freud. I hate that we have to talk about him because his ideas just aren't useful anymore. They did stimulate interest in the field, but they're not what we currently think about personality. So instead, let's talk about this guy. He's way cooler. We'll talk about the humanistic theories, which had a much more positive look on people. They wanted to study the motivations of healthy people instead of sick people, so that they could find ways that people can strive for self-determination and self-realization. So the two big players in humanistic theories is Maslow and Rogers. So we'll talk about Maslow first. So Maslow developed this hierarchy of needs. And he said that we are constantly trying to become self-actualized. That's the goal in life, is to become self-actualized, to reach the top of this hierarchy. But first, we have to meet the needs of all of the ones below. You can't meet the needs of a higher one before you have met the needs of the one below it. Right? So people, for example, can't be thinking about their health and their resources if they're constantly not having enough food and water and shelter to survive. So first they have to address those physiological needs before they can even consider their safety. If people aren't safe and healthy, then they can't possibly start to think about friendships and intimacy and feeling connected in their community. So we constantly have to meet the needs below before we can even consider the ones above. And he said that the goal is to become self-actualized, which is the process of fulfilling our potential, and self-transcendence, or finding meaning and purpose beyond ourselves. So what he did is he studied people who were self-actualized, and he found that a lot of them have experienced the spiritual or personal peak experience, something in their life that happened that became the driving force behind their growth in life. So an experience with other people, helping others, volunteer work, something like that. And self-concept is what Maslow thought was kind of the central feature of our personality, and the goal was always to make our self-concept the same as our ideal self. So making who we think that we are the same as who we want to be. That's the goal, to make those overlap. So the other humanistic theorist is Rogers, and he developed this person-centered perspective. So he thought that people can't grow or succeed unless they're in an environment that allows for it. So to do that, to make a growth-promoting social environment, we have to give people three conditions: acceptance / unconditional positive regard, genuineness, and empathy. So unconditional positive regard is accepting and valuing people regardless of any wrongs that they've done. So not necessarily accepting the things that they've done, but accepting them as people, accepting those wrongs, and still having positive regard for them unconditionally. Genuineness, he said that we need to be open about our own feelings. We shouldn't be fake and lie whenever we disagree with some of their actions or feel like something is off. Being completely transparent and self-disclosing to people. And this is kind of in terms of like a therapist and a client relationship. And then providing empathy, so listening and feeling what they're feeling, and reflecting that back to them so that they can see that you're kind of on the same wave, and being able to put yourself in their shoes and feel what they're feeling. And Rogers agreed that self-concept was kind of a big part of our personality. So the self-concept, the thoughts and feelings that we have about who we are. And so the goal, again, was to make the self-concept match our ideal self, who we want to be. So who we are and who we want to be would be the same. That's the goal of humanistic theory. Okay, so that's kind of the classical perspectives on personality, the psychodynamic theory, and then humanistic theories. And then next time we'll talk about some of the more contemporary perspectives, so the ones that we use today, like trait theories and stuff like that. So this quiz will be due, what's this one? Thursdays? This quiz will be due on Friday at midnight. If you have any questions at all, shoot me an email and I'd be happy to answer them. Have a good weekend, guys.